ceases to remind us that we are fallen people and that we live in a fallen world. Remember the words of Isaiah when God called him to be a prophet. Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among the people of unclean lips." Well, that's the testimony of the whole world. We could all say that. One of the strongest evidences we have in the Bible that God doesn't want us to forget that we live in a fallen world and that we are fallen people is the book that is our subject today, the book of Lamentations. You know what a lament is, or a lamentation, lament, same thing. An expression of sorrow or grief or mourning or perhaps regret. That's a lamentation. We have a whole book that is devoted to lamentation, expressions of sorrow, mourning, grief. Just this morning when I got up, I'm always thinking about the text and the message for the day. It's the last thing I do on Saturday night. It's the first thing I do Sunday morning. Pray about the message. And for some reason, it just popped into my head this morning. I was thinking about the house where my beloved Carol lived all of her life. It was a little frame house on 5274 Stonewall Hill Road in Fairburn, Georgia, 30213. And that house, her father, I called him Mr. Otis Aldridge. Mr. Otis built with his own hands. And he wasn't a carpenter, he was a mechanic, but he knew enough that he built the whole house himself. And when he and Miss Frances got married, they moved into that house that he had built with his own hands, and they lived there all their lives. He died in 1982, in May of 1982. And she had Alzheimer's, and she died some years later, but they lived there all their married life. Carol was raised there. All the kids were raised there. So after Miss Frances had to move out into a nursing home, they sold the house. The children sold the house. And I don't know who lived there, but some years later, the house burned. So Carol and I used to go by there sometimes just to see it. And it was so sad because here's this house that had so many memories. So much of her life was tied up in that house. My life too, because I dated her, and when I was dating her, it was always at her house. Every Sunday night, it was macaroni and cheese. Loose, by the way. We always specified having loose macaroni and cheese. And Carol made that every Sunday night. Anyway, I love that house and had a lot of memories there. And it was just a burned out shell. One of the times we visited there, we got a brick from that house and kept it as a kind of a keepsake. I was there not too many months ago and drove by it, and it's still there. They haven't done anything with it. It's just that burned out shell. And you know, you've seen things like that. It touches at your heart. It just makes you sad. Well, something like that, but by orders of magnitude more intensified, is the book of Lamentations, because the author of Lamentations, and probably it was Jeremiah, we don't know that, the Bible doesn't say, it's technically anonymous, but most everybody thinks that Jeremiah wrote it, and he probably did, so we're just going to say Jeremiah, even though you understand we don't know that for sure. But Jeremiah is writing after Jerusalem has been destroyed. The temple has been burned to the ground by the Babylonians. The city has been destroyed. 3 separate times the Babylonians came in waves against Jerusalem and Judea, and they carried exiles away. In the first group there was Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And then in the second group there was Ezekiel. We'll be preaching on Ezekiel next week. And then there were others in the third group. But in those 3 waves, hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of Jews were taken away from their land into a foreign land. Most of them, of course, died in that farmland, and they never saw their homeland again. And Jerusalem itself was in ruins. So Jeremiah, we'll call the author of Lamentations Jeremiah. Jeremiah looks at Jerusalem burned to the ground, destroyed, and he begins to wail. He pours out his lament. So what you have in Lamentations, you have 5 chapters, and these 5 chapters tell a story. The first part of the story is in chapter 1, and that is simply a description of the misery of Israel after the destruction by the Babylonians. Look at verse 1 of chapter 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly. Speaking of Jerusalem now, as though Jerusalem were a woman. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. He's speaking of the fact here that Jerusalem had gone astray, straight away from the one true God. Her husband, the one true God. And she sought out other paramours, lovers. And among all those, there was none to comfort her. There was no help among any of them. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. And he goes on in the first chapter to describe in great detail the miseries, the sorrows of the Jewish people, those who are left in Jerusalem, who have to deal with a city and a land that has been devastated, and those who have been taken away from their homeland into a foreign country where they will die and never see their home again. You know, I don't know how to help us enter into the depth of the feeling here. I can only say, think of the saddest moment of your life. Think back to August 5th, 4 o'clock in the morning, when I realized my sweetheart had breathed her last. And for days after that, I told God, I don't want to live. That's about as close as I can come to the first chapter of Lamentations. The miseries of Israel because of her sin. That leads us to the second chapter. Now the story takes a turn, because in this chapter, and you notice this right away, in this chapter, Jeremiah points to the source of this misery. Why this misery? Well, it's from God. God did this. Jeremiah pulls no punches. He makes it clear. He makes it plain. There's no beating around the bush here. He's not trying to be nice or trying to avoid negativity. He tells it like it is. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. How the Lord in his anger, look at this, it's the Lord. He's the one doing this. He's the one who's done this. How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven on earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy. In his wrath he has broken down. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. If you read this chapter, you'll read that over and over, time and time again, Jeremiah says, he. God has done this. Make no mistake about it, God has done this. Now, of course, truth is, and Jeremiah knew this full well, in fact, he'll mention this later on. But the truth is that God had warned Israel time and time again that this would happen if they were disobedient. In fact, I'm not going to ask you to turn there, but in fact, I'm not going to read it because it's way, way too long and would take us too far afield. But way back in Deuteronomy, before the Israelites ever entered the Promised Land, Deuteronomy, Moses preaches to the people. Deuteronomy is a series of sermons, is what it is. We talked about that when I preached all that book way back a long time ago. So, one of those sermons has to do with the blessings and the cursings of God. And he says, if you're obedient, and if you adhere to the covenant, if you keep faith with my covenant, then I will pour out these blessings on you. But if you don't keep covenant, if you aren't faithful, then I will pour out curses on you. And beginning in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy and verse 15, all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 68, it is a series of curses. And if you read through that series of curses and then go to Lamentations, you see, everything that God said was going to happen if you were disobedient, that's exactly what happened. God announced it before. Hundreds of years before it ever happened, God announced it. And in fact, in the prophet Jeremiah himself, we talked last week about the message of Jeremiah. Well, Jeremiah prophesies that this doom is coming, this great enemy, this scourge of the north, which is Assyria, they're coming, and then later Babylon, but Jeremiah even goes so far as to predict exactly how long the exile will last. He says it's going to last for 70 years, and it did. It lasted 70 years. From 605, when the first exiles were taken away, and the first destruction on Jerusalem was effected by the Babylonians, from 605 to 535, 70 years. That's exactly how long it lasted. So God had warned his people that if they were disobedient, unfaithful, this was going to happen. And now, says Jeremiah in Lamentations, it has happened. He did exactly what he said. But that leads to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is an account of how the misery of Israel, first of all, in chapter 2, the misery of Israel is God's doing. God did this. Chapter 3, the misery of Israel is a crisis of faith for Jeremiah himself. Look at chapter 3. Let's look at the beginning of chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction. Under the rod of his, that is God's wrath, he has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turned his hand again and again, the whole day long. I want you to pay attention to these verses. Because notice that Jeremiah is talking about these miseries that have come on Israel, the nation of Israel. Many of the Israelites taken into exile in Babylon, and they'll never go home again. Those who are left, the poorest of the land, have nothing. The land is devastated. The temple is burned to the ground, the temple that God instructed David to prepare for and instructed Solomon to build. That would be the visible representation, the visible symbol of the presence of the invisible God. The temple destroyed, the city broken, the city's walls broken down, and the land without inhabitants, as one of the prophets says. So Jeremiah looks at all this, and he's not personally affected by these things, but he is. There's a kind of irony here. He's kind of on the outside looking in. Yeah, he's an Israelite, but he's not in Babylon. And we know, if this was Jeremiah, we know from reading in the book of Jeremiah that he had land elsewhere. He had land that was still intact. But he says that I am undone because of all this. This is for Jeremiah. The misery of Israel is a crisis of faith for Jeremiah. So look down, if you will, at verse 17 of chapter 3. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. It's as if the exile has sucked all the life out of Jeremiah. I have no happiness. I have no peace anymore. Well, that kind of begs the question, well, why is this a crisis of faith for Jeremiah? Well, that takes us to chapter 4. For in chapter 4, we have a connection between the misery of Israel and the purposes of God. The miseries of Israel, what has happened to Israel, the exile, is a kind of test of the purposes of God. Before I read anything from chapter 4, and I'm going to read a couple of verses in chapter 4, but before I read there, I want to try to put this into some kind of perspective. So, God calls Abraham out of Ur the Chaldees. This is Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham, and he says, I will make you a great nation. Okay? Your descendants will be like the sand of the seashore. So, God builds Abraham into a nation. Ultimately, that nation, of course, goes down into Egypt. This is during the days of Jacob and his sons. You remember that story. And so they served as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And then God sends Moses to them to bring them out. And with a powerful, outstretched arm, God delivers them. He even parts the waters of the Red Sea and takes the Israelites through on dry land and then drowns the armies of Pharaoh. So God preserves, protects, and defends his people. Then he leads them 40 years in the wilderness as they wander until finally he brings them to the land of Moab and across the Jordan River and begin conquest of the land that God had promised Abraham. So God has kept his promise. And so God declares that in this land that he has given, this land of Canaan, which he has given to his people, he's going to pick one place to put his name there. It's going to be, well, we would call it the capital, but it's more than just a political capital. It's like the city, the place that God designates for himself. It's where he's going to put the symbol of his presence. It's going to be the one place on earth that he designates as his very own. And of course, that's Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he instructs David to prepare his son Solomon to build a temple to the glory of his name. And that temple will be the symbol of the presence of God. God can't dwell in a building made with hands. The earth itself cannot contain God. But it's a symbol. Just as this church with its steeple is a symbol to the community, not that God lives in here or that the Holy Spirit lives in here, but this is a symbol to the community of the gospel, the presence of God. Okay, so the temple is that, Jerusalem is that, but now think for a moment. The Babylonians have destroyed Jerusalem. They burned the temple to the ground. Which begs a question, doesn't it? What about the purposes of God? What about all those promises that God made? That he would put you in the land. And now, he's devastated the land through the Babylonians and taken away the cream of the crop. They've all gone to Babylon, never to return. So what does this mean for the promises of God? Does this mean that God's promises are null and void? You know, the Apostle Paul asked the very same question in Romans. When we get there later on, toward the end of the year, during Advent, I think we're going to be in Romans. And in Romans, the Apostle Paul poses that very question. You know, the Israelites, by and large, have not believed. He says, my people, my heart is grieved for my people because they don't believe. They haven't received the gospel. They haven't believed in the Messiah. But does this mean that God's promises are null and void? And Paul answers, may it never be. God's promises are very much alive and well. God always keeps his promises. But the rejection of Christ by Israel calls into question the promises of God. And that's exactly what Jeremiah says about the destruction of the temple. It calls into question the purposes of God. Well, I said I would read from chapter 4. I want you to turn to chapter 4. I want to show you a verse or two. A verse or two in chapter 4. So, toward the end of that chapter, Jeremiah says something very interesting and very important. By the way, you need to know, and this is going to be clear from chapter 5, and we're going to go back to chapter 3 as well, but Jeremiah never loses faith. He has questions. He's a reminder to us that it's okay to ask questions. There's nothing sinful about doubts. Jeremiah, you might say, has his doubts. He wonders, how is it that God is faithful to his promises when the temple is destroyed? The very thing that symbolized his presence. It's gone. But Jeremiah knows, deep down inside, he knows that God has not forgotten his promises and that God cannot be unfaithful. So, look at the crisis of faith for, the test of God's promises in verse 20. The breath of our nostrils, the Lord's anointed, meaning Israel, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, the pits of the Babylonians, of whom, that is the Israelites, God's anointed, of whom we said, look at this, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. So what Jeremiah is saying here is this. He just asks, how can this be? We are the people God chose. God called Abraham. God called Israel. Not because Israel was great, but because he chose Israel. But he did that. He chose Israel. He said that we were his anointed people. We were his chosen people. And so we said, as the Jewish people, that we will sit under the shadow of the Almighty among the nations. Okay? So the destruction of the temple has called all of this into question. But now look at the end of chapter 4. A very important verse in Lamentations, verse 22. The punishment of your iniquities, O daughter of Zion, is what? Say it, church. Is accomplished. God is still acting according to his eternal purpose. His purposes have not changed. What he warned would happen in Deuteronomy 28 has happened. But remember, God warned about that. And even though in the meantime they built the temple and established the priesthood, the sacrificial system, and all these things, all these trappings of their Jewish faith, God had warned them, if you're unfaithful, then I will judge you, and this is the judgment. And that judgment has taken place. Notice what Jeremiah says. This is so important. The punishment of your iniquities, O daughter of Zion, Israel, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer, but your iniquities, O daughter of Eden, he will punish. He will uncover your sin. And so Jeremiah takes assurance in the fact that God's purposes have not changed, and his punishment has accomplished. His punishment on Israel's sin has accomplished God's purpose. So that leads us to the very end of Lamentations, chapter 5, which is, for all intents and purposes, a prayer. Or we might say it this way: the miseries of Israel are a call to prayer, to seek the face of this one faithful God. I'm going to read the end of that chapter 5 in just a moment. I want to take you back for a moment to chapter 3. I said a moment ago that Jeremiah never lost faith. He questioned, he wondered, what is God doing? But deep down inside, he knows that God is doing what God does. God does according to his eternal purposes. And his purposes never change. God doesn't change his mind. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't say, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have done that. No, God knew from the very beginning what he would do and how he would do it. And it was all according to his purpose. And his purpose in judging Israel was to bring them back. That was his purpose, to bring them back. He never intended that the exile would be forever. He only intended to purify them and bring them back. So in chapter 3, in this passage that Ms. Carey read a few moments ago, I want us to look up in verse 20, and then I'm going to read down to this very important verse 25. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. He's speaking now of this personal crisis of faith, this wondering, what is God up to? Why is this happening? But verse 21, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. We're going to sing this great hymn just in a few moments. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Thereafter I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. Before I bring this tie a string around the end of this, with a couple of applications. Every time I preach on one of these books of the Bible, I want to try to give you a verse to hang on to that in some way summarizes or captures the spirit of the whole book. Well, in Lamentations, it would be chapter 3, that verse I just read, and verse 25. That verse captures the spirit of Jeremiah in Lamentations. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. The Lord has judged Israel because they were unfaithful. They didn't wait on the Lord. But the Lord waits to be merciful, to receive back those who wait for him, who seek his face. I want to make a couple of quick applications here. One is this. God is a relentless God. And what I mean by that is that God will work in your life and in my life in every possible way to draw you to Christ, to draw you to faithfulness and to obedience. God will do whatever it takes to bring you to true faith. You already know that one of my favorite authors is C.S. Lewis. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on C.S. Lewis, so I think I read everything he ever wrote, which was a lot. He wrote something like 60-something books. I don't know, probably hundreds of articles. But anyway, he wrote this little book, The Problem of Pain. A wonderful, wonderful little book where he delves into, well, the problem of pain. Why is there pain and suffering in the world? And there are a number of explanations from Scripture, but and Lewis examines these. But there's one in particular that bears on the book of Lamentations. How God judged Israel for her sin, just as he said he would, but in order to purify them and to bring them back to himself. His whole purpose was restoration. That was his whole purpose. I want you to listen to what C.S. Lewis said about one of God's purposes in pain in our lives. Whether it's physical pain, emotional pain, whatever the pain may be, but we often think physical. And one of those purposes that God has, listen to this. We can rest contentedly in our sins and in our stupidities. And anyone who has watched gluttons shoveling down the most exquisite foods as if they did not know what they were eating will admit that we can ignore our pleasures. Isn't that true? We can ignore our pleasures. We can take them for granted. We can think, oh, we deserve that. It's only as much as I would expect. But listen to this. And Lewis adds this. But pain insists on being attended to. You can't ignore pain. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Would you say that's true? I would say it's true. We experience pain. One of the things we often do, and we should do, is to ask, oh, what is God saying to me? You know, not that he inflicted pain as this a judgment or something, although that could be. Scripture says so. But at the very least, the pains, the sufferings, the trials, the tribulations of our lives ought to make us ask God what you're up to. What do you have for me in this? What do you have for me to learn in this? God is relentless. One of my favorite poems is a poem from the late 19th century, late 1800s, by a British poet named Francis Thompson. You may have heard the title of it, even if you've never read the poem. It's a fairly long poem, and I'm not going to quote it here or read it. But Francis Thompson was a very talented, gifted writer, one of England's best poets. He probably never got the credit he really deserved, partly because he died young. He was only 47 years old when he died in 1907. But his father wanted him to be a medical doctor. And he started medical school, but decided, you know, like a lot of young people, he wanted to chart his own path. Like Paul Tournier, the Christian Swiss psychiatrist, used to say, as a teenager, the child takes off his parents' cloak and knits his own. So Francis Thompson decided he didn't want to be a doctor, he wanted to be a poet, he wanted to be a writer. In England in those days, that was a good occupation, profession. But anyway, so he quits medical school and strikes out to be a writer. And like somebody who goes to Hollywood thinking they're going to make it big in the movies, and they wind up, as Dionne Warwick said, parking cars and pumping gas. He wound up on the streets, addicted to opium. For over a year, he lived on the streets of London, addicted to opium. But a family took him in, recognized his talent, and helped, in his own words, to save him. But he acknowledged that it was God who had done the saving, and he wrote a poem about it. You've heard the title, I imagine. Some of the lines go like this. With unhurried chase and unperturbed pace, the hound of heaven followed. The poem is entitled The Hound of Heaven. He likens God to a hound which doesn't give up chasing a rabbit. He will not give up until he catches it. God is the hound of heaven. God will not give up on you until you say yes to him or die. God is relentless. The second application I want to make very quickly is this. And it's from that fourth chapter and then the fifth, and we're going to close with this. That verse in the fourth chapter, the third chapter. In the third chapter, verse 25. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. God is relentless. He will do whatever it takes to bring you to himself. But you should never worry. His arms are always open wide. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. If you seek the Lord while he may be found. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. You never have to worry that God will not accept you. He is waiting for you to come to him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. So that leads us to the very end of Lamentations. This was our call to worship, and this is the end of our message. Lamentations chapter 5 is a call to prayer. And the very last verses, 20 21 and 22 are in fact a prayer. It's a prayer of faith because, remember, Jeremiah had already said, because I know your faithfulness is everlasting, I have hope. And so in that hope he prays, restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored, renew our days as of old. Seek the Lord while he may be found. He's waiting. Thanks be to God. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the way that you've spoken to my heart this week in this word. And I pray, Lord, that you will bring this word often to mind for all of us who have heard it today. We will take comfort in your relentless pursuit of us, your desire to make us what you want us to be, and your readiness and willingness to bless all who come to you. Oh God, thank you for being such a God of mercy. Truly, your mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name.